Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Shack. Straight off the bat, I want to say a massive thank you to one of our viewers, Matthew Wright, for without your not inconsiderable contribution, this video would probably not have surfaced for quite a while, because what we're looking at today is quite rare and they don't come cheap. Back when, in the UK at least, the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 ruled the roost in most teenagers' front rooms, or bedrooms if they were a bit well off, and the BBC Micro was holding the fort in most schools, the market was awash with pretenders to the throne. We've previously looked at the Acorn Electron, which had designs on the Spectrum's stronghold, and of course we looked at the Atari 8-bit series, which just failed to get a hold on the UK market as strongly as it had in the States. Other UK computers yet to feature on the channel were also snapping at the heels of the big boys, such as the Dragon 32 and the Auric 1, and the push of Apple, Texas Instruments and Radio Shack were an ever-present threat from the US. And then, in September 1983, an unknown company threw a rather large fox in amongst the rightfully scared chickens. Out of nowhere, they announced a machine that on paper at least was powerful, had amazing graphics, a flexible sound system, some really innovative features, and was particularly beautiful to boot. So who were this company, and what is this machine that's got an aging retro computer fan all worked up and emotional like? Well, let's find out. Here at the Shack, we'd like to give a huge thank you to the sponsor for this video, PCBWay. They help us out with all of our PCB fabrication needs and make fantastic boards at amazingly competitive prices. And it's not only PCBs that are on the menu. Apart from other fabrication services like CNC machining, 3D printing, sheet metal fabrication and injection moulding, PCBWay also have a great projects library of cool stuff to build from people all around the world. Oh, and if you don't like waving a soldering iron about, they can even assemble your PCBs for you. That's the PCB way. Right, on with the show. Well, the company was Elan Computers Limited, and the machine, well, here it is, the Enterprise 64, and I'm sure you'll agree that even from the image on the box, it's a belter in terms of looks, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that the designers of Amstrad's 1984 CPC series took a good look at this machine when it hit the press in '83, as there's more than a passing resemblance in the colour schemes. But that aside, and before we embark on what is for me a true bucket list moment, unboxing this machine that I quite literally drooled over as a 14-year-old Spectrum owner, let's take a little look at the history of how this machine came to exist in the first place. And that story begins in Hong Kong, where a trading company called Locumals had decided they wanted a piece of that burgeoning UK home computer market and wanted to do so with a UK designed machine. They commissioned a UK company called Intelligent Software, who were probably best known at the time for the Cirrus chess program, which isn't surprising when you learn that the boss of Intelligent Software was David Levy, himself an international chess grandmaster. David already had considerable presence in the technology market, from developing and marketing the most advanced chess computers you could reasonably expect to own. Remember, this was back in the day when Cray supercomputers were being rolled out to take on the human champions. One of David's machines, the C64 Mark V, hit the headlines when it not only beat British chess champion Dr. John Nunn 5 games out of 6, but also found 3 valid solutions to an age-old chess problem, which was interesting because the entire chess-playing world thought there was only one. An interesting side note here, and one that really ties together the history of this machine and that of the machine it had in its sights, the ZX Spectrum, is that the C64 Mark V chess computer owes its visual design to none other than Ian Sinclair, brother of the legendary Clive Sinclair. It's a small world. David Levy also went on to be part of the ZX Spectrum Vega project, which counted Sir Clive himself in amongst its backers, but that's a story for another day. Lockyamal's tasked Intelligent Software with a machine that could compete and beat the other machines on the market, and to do so in a financially attractive package. Going by the unflattering name of Damp-Proof course throughout early development, the name of the machine changed frequently and often in full view of the eagerly awaiting public by way of the computer press. We saw this machine go from Samurai to Oscar, Elan, unbelievably Flan, and finally everyone seemed happy to settle on Enterprise. By the time the machine was released, the company itself had been renamed from Elan Computers Limited to Enterprise Computers Limited, but what's in a name when it's all about the machine itself? The hardware was designed by Dave Woodfield and Nick Toop, who both already had a considerable pedigree to their names and certainly didn't hold back when designing the machine's two ASIC chips for graphics and sound. And just like in other machines, these chips were given names. Dave and Nick. How did they come up with those? Well, we'll speak more on the topic of ASICs later. The Enterprise was to have specifications that were intended to be a cut above the other machines on the market, including up to 4 megabytes of addressable memory and expansion options to rival the BBC Micro, and you can't deny the ambition. But despite having over 80,000 pre-orders taken when the machine was unveiled to the public in 1984, a series of further delays meant the machine didn't make it into the hands of consumers until June of 1985, nearly 2 years after it was announced. And 2 years for the computer industry in the 1980s was a lifetime. By the time consumers got the machine, the computing world had moved on, and the Enterprise, as clever and ambitious as it was, had become a victim of time. Let's take a look at those specifications and see how they compared against the Spectrum and Commodore 64 in 1983 when the Enterprise was announced. And we can see that the CPU is a bit quicker, the resolution of the screen much higher, the number of colours much higher, the sound was on a par, at least on paper, with the Commodore 64, and you know what, this looks like a pretty good fight. But against the Atari ST and the Amiga 1000, the incoming range of 16-bit home computers, both also released in 1985, the same year the Enterprise finally hit the market, it's a different story. Here we see an aging 8-bit Z80 against the new up-and-coming 16-bit machines running at much faster clock speeds. The memory also suffers, with the new machines having at least 4 times, sometimes 8 times as much. It still holds its own in the maximum resolution, but this was monochrome of course, although the same could be said for the Atari ST. The maximum colours still suffered against the newer machines, but the sound arguably still better than the Atari ST, although really nothing could compete with the Amiga at this point. The Enterprise had some nifty tricks up its sleeve, such as the ability to mix and match graphics modes on a single screen, and 4 channels of sound, each of which could be placed anywhere in the stereo spectrum. Enterprise computers are reportedly the first company to implement its own version of BASIC from scratch to the then recently proposed ANSI standard. The language, which came on a separate ROM cartridge and was called IS Basic, the IS being Intelligent Software, was very advanced but had a few inexplicable quirks, such as having to type clear screen in full rather than using the ubiquitous CLS that most other implementations of BASIC supported. Another inexplicable oversight is that the sound came from a rather tinny internal speaker like the Spectrum, and wasn't output to your TV like the C64. You could use the cassette output port on the back of the machine to pipe the sound to your hi-fi system, but if you did that, you couldn't write to a cassette at the same time. Unfortunately, it seems Enterprise computers' claim that the machine had obsolescence built out now seemed a little ironic. Also, at its launch in 1985, the Enterprise 64 would have cost you £250, which, when you consider at that point you could buy an Amstrad CPC 464 for the same price, and that came with a built-in cassette deck and a monitor, albeit only monochrome, the Enterprise started to look like a difficult choice. Retailers unfortunately agreed and found them hard to sell at the price points that Enterprise wanted. Any combination of a lack of software, emerging new machines, a downturn in the home computer market, and even the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System could all be cited as potential reasons for a machine not to perform. And with the Enterprise, it had to cope with all of those at the same time, and it couldn't. Sales were slow, and despite the release of the Enterprise 128K, which is exactly the same machine but with double the memory, bringing about a subsequent reduction in the cost of the 64K model to £180, sales weren't quick to increase. Other 128K models from other manufacturers, such as the Sinclair Spectrum 128K, the Commodore 128 and the Amstrad CPC 6128, stole the limelight of the Enterprise 2. By the summer of 1986, Enterprise had debts of around £8 million and went into liquidation soon after. Okay, let's unbox this and just imagine what impact this would have had if it had been released in 1983. This machine is still the one that I remember only ever seeing in the press and never seeing in real life until now, and I have to say it's even more beautiful in real life than it ever was in photographs. It's surprisingly light. I always imagined it to be quite a heavy machine like the BBC Micro, but it isn't. No clicky keys here, as it uses a soft membrane like the Spectrum and the QL. Let's have a look at what else is in the box. This little green thing is the top of the built-in joystick. I imagine most of these got lost at some point. Hopefully I won't lose this one. There's a quick start guide here with some unused mail-ins for the user club and the guarantee, and the guide itself looks totally unused. In fact, this whole machine was advertised as unused, which I doubt, but it does look in very good condition. There's a demonstration manual, which is essentially a sequence of type-in programs that demonstrate some of the features of the machine, a useful introduction for the new owner. And then we have the full user manual, which is a hefty tome and in keeping with the type of manual you got with the ZX Spectrum and the C64, containing a full basic programming language reference and loads of actual information about the machine. There's the welcome cassette, which appears to be unopened and unused. That's nice. Next we have the power supply, which, in another nod to the Spectrum, is a 9V centre negative power supply. Well, actually 9.5. In fact, you can use an aftermarket ZX Spectrum power supply rather than fork out a lot of money on an Enterprise specific one. This cable looks like it's never been unwound either, and looks like the plastic has reacted with the polystyrene of the box. One set of cassette leads, and I might be mistaken, but I thought they shipped with two sets, as you could link two cassette recorders at the same time for some peculiar and seemingly unnecessary reason that I can't recall right now. This IS Basic cartridge has seen, shall we say, better days, and I'll be relabeling that at some point in the future. I just hope it works. Lastly in here is the RF cable, which we won't be using because I've bitten the bullet and brought a SCART cable for this machine, and I'll also be using a more modern power supply too, so we can pop it all back in the box for now, except for the machine itself, which we can then gawk at for a while and try not to dribble too much. Which is difficult, I'm sure you'll agree, because, well, just look at it. It really is a thing of beauty. Businesslike and playful at the same time, substantial but manageable, elegant and stylish throughout. Where the colours look garish on the CPC, they look resplendent here. I wish I'd bought one back in the day, I really do. I probably wouldn't have even cared that it failed as a platform. I didn't have the disposable cash to trade in my CPC when the Enterprise was launched, and by the time I had the money, the Enterprise had warped into obscurity and I ended up with an Atari ST. By the time this machine had popped its clogs, a lot of clever things had been achieved, or at least planned for it. You could load and play most Spectrum programs, giving you a vast back catalogue. Different programming languages were available for it. You could be programming in Forth by just swapping the cartridge, and there were peripherals on the horizon that looked great but sadly never saw the light of day. and that meant that this port didn't get to see a lot of action. The back of the machine has a bright red reset button, followed by the joystick ports, the printer and serial or network port, the 2 cassette ports, bit odd as I said, the monitor port, TV out, a UHF frequency selector and the power input. The right hand side of the machine is where the cartridge socket lives, and remember that there was no inbuilt language in ROM, so if you wanted to program you needed a language cartridge in here. Like the BBC Micro, you could pop little cardboard strips under this plastic flap to remind you what the function keys did in different programs, like an early analog touch bar. And the joystick is a bit of a novelty really, not very nice, but at least it's 8-way, so you could move the cursor on the screen diagonally, you know, if that's your thing. Right, enough looking at it, let's switch it on. Nice new 9V center negative power supply and an incredibly pricey SCART cable, because as you'll have noticed when we were looking at the back of the machine, all of the ports are simply edge connectors, so there's nothing standard about those ports at all. I'm actually a bit apprehensive about this, as it's genuinely the first time I've ever seen one of these machines in real life, and to be honest I'll be absolutely gutted if it doesn't work. Popping in this tatty IS basic cartridge isn't filling me with hope either. In goes the SCART connection on the back of the machine, handily labelled with up, as there's no shape or guide on the machine itself. And lastly, we'll plug in the power. Now, the moment of truth. Will it boot? Well, yes it does, and this fills me with joy. The colours, look at all the pretty colours. Pressing a key takes us into basic, and well, you know I have to do this. Well, that made me a very happy chap. All is well in the world of the Enterprise. Now I'm wondering what happens if you attempt to boot the machine without a ROM cartridge in, so let's try that. Okay, same boot screen, same pretty colours, but this time it appears to boot into a word processor. Interesting. Well, there's a lot more to dig into with this machine, but here's the issue. The machine is rare, software is rare, peripherals are rarer than hen's teeth. I hear there's an SD card solution, so I'm going to see if I can either build or buy one of those and feature that in the next episode. If you can help me out there, I'd be very grateful. Until then, we'll need to rely on emulation to show some of what those lovely ASIC chips can do. Come on Nick and Dave, show us your stuff. I can't help thinking that 1983 would have had a very different home computing landscape, at least in the UK, if this machine had come out on time. Anyway, that's it for this episode, and as always, we hope you've enjoyed it. If you like the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications of new content. Please leave your comments below, as we always love to read them, and if you had one of these machines, we'd love to know what you thought of it. If you've got anything you'd like to donate and see featured on the channel, please drop us an email. If you'd like to support us, there are links for Patreon and our Buy Us a Coffee page in the banner on the main channel page. So until next time in the Retro Shack, it's goodbye from me and see you next time.